Welcome back, everybody. Thanks so much for everybody returning. That was fascinating. We are all star stuff, as you heard. So we're about to start with the next set of speakers. I want to express some admiration for Didier and the speakers in the first group for all sticking to time. I'm sure the speakers in this next group will equally stick to time, but will be fascinating too. So let's welcome James Hughes, the Executive Director of the International Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technology.
Hello, friends. So I want to do a brief review of how I got here. 35 years ago, I started this journal, EcoSocialist Review, which I was a student socialist activist and had been very taken with the ideas of the German Greens. The American Green Party had gotten started. And I wanted to make an intervention into the debates about what a politics would look like that was consistent with both green politics and left-wing social justice. I have never been a communist. I'm an anti-communist, but it was clear that both communist states and social democratic states had fallen off the rails, had not done what was necessary to protect ecological sustainability. Nonetheless, the opinion of the eco-socialists was that socialist policies were a necessary prerequisite for us getting to ecological sustainability, that they needed to take into account the interests and the economic security and prosperity of the majority of people who would have to enact these policies. Now, when I stopped publishing EcoSocialist Review in 1994, I got deeply involved in biopolitical questions, eventually becoming executive director of Humanity Plus, which was then called World Transhumanist Association, and that led to the founding of the IET and the beginning of a conversation about what the politics are of in that corner of the ideological world that we were in, at the intersection of progressive political values and transhumanist thinking. We began to call that position technoprogressivism, and a number of people have taken up the term technoprogressivism. There's an enormous amount of variety in terms of the people who identify or use the term technoprogressivism, all the way from social liberalism to new forms of communism or technocracy, and a variety of opinions about the kinds of technologies that should be focused on in this domain. However, at the 2014 Paris Transition, we articulated a technoprogressive declaration that outlined a number of steps that we should be taking towards developing the technoprogressive point of view in a number of different social movements, a number of different domains, as a consistent political point of view. Now, I want to review why I think eco-socialism frames, importantly, elements of the technoprogressive vision in regards to ecology. One part that eco-socialists and I think most technoprogressives would share is the idea that any kind of pastoral romanticism about our ancestors is misplaced, that hunters and gatherers and farmers, agricultural civilizations were not in fact green, that there's substantial evidence that they had mega effects on their environment, the elimination of large animals from North America and Australia as humans began to filter into those environments, examples of hunter-gatherer despoilation, and agricultural civilizations similarly were only limited by their scale, not by their attention to ecological details. So capitalism alone cannot explain our ecological destruction, although it probably exacerbates it. I think we both share, eco-socialists and the techno-progressives in general, share the idea that there are some preconditions for what it takes to have an ecologically sustainable civilization. One is contemporary science. We have to understand, we have to have the tools and the models to understand what we're doing and what the effects of it are going to be, to take an active managerial interest in this environment that we're shaping. And we have to be able to come up with technological alternatives if we see that the things that we're doing aren't going in the right direction. Now, I'm also a social democrat, so I will emphasize the importance of civil liberties as well as economic and political equality in moving us towards the kind of ecological policies that we need. We need to have a regulatory state that is not simply driven by the same industrial prerogatives. We need to have independent citizen movements that put pressure on the state. And you can see the failure of that in state capitalist regimes or communist regimes that have pursued disastrous environmental policies because they do not allow a space for an independent environmental critique in their societies. I think we also share the perspective that population itself is not a problem, that the concerns about overpopulation have a Malthusian, an incorrect Malthusian history, and that they are usually directed at the fertility of the poor and not in fact the fertility of rich white guys like myself who happen to consume 10 times, 100 times as many resources as the poor folks around the world. And that the best way, if you're concerned about fertility, is to educate women. And if you educate women, their fertility drops, as has been precipitously happening around the world, so that fertility, in fact, will probably drop so far that the majority of the world will begin to shrink by about 2050. Therefore, overpopulation, at least in the absence of some radical new anti-aging technology, which we may get to, is not an issue that we need to address. Now, where eco-socialists and techno-progressives begin to have distinct perspectives is what is the role, how do we achieve ecological protection under democratic capitalism? Democratic capitalism is a system in which the profitability of the private sector underwrites the fiscal capacities of the state. All politicians have to address this. All politicians under democratic capitalism are also subject to the political discipline of capital, either by direct campaign contributions, by their influence through think tanks and other political agencies. And so as long as we allow mega profits to be made by sectors of the economy like big oil, big carbon, that allow for that distortion of the political process, even if a majority says that we need to move away from carbon towards an ecologically sustainable future, that will be distorted by these corporate impacts. And so this is an argument for why we need to take away their wealth and power and have citizen movements and political parties that are independent of those pressures. Also at the international level, international competition, capitalist competition makes it very difficult for countries to shift to ecological policies because they tend to increase costs and reduce profitability. And this is especially true for the path to industrialization that state capitalist regimes like Russia and China have pursued. They basically for 100 years have put the communist parties in place of capitalists to frog march their societies into industrialization. Environmental consequences be damned, and if you make an environmental complaint, you get sent to the gulag. So that didn't work very well, and it was largely because they were in a competition, a global capitalist competition with Western technology. So the eco-socialists would argue that we need to advance. If we want to sell these policies, one of the things that under democratic capitalism, it's very difficult to convince working class populations that these kinds of ecological visions are going to be attractive for them. And so as a consequence, we need to propose a package of social transition policies that will convince working class people, the democratic majorities, that these policies will be in their interest, not only because they preserve the planet, but also because they are an attractive future in their own right. They will provide all the goods, the economic security, and the kinds of jobs and so forth that people want. This has been the project of efforts to build green labor coalitions, to meld red and green politics, to create an environmental justice movement. And it has resulted today in many countries in the concept of a Green New Deal, an omnibus piece of legislation or an omnibus approach to legislation, which merges all the massive infrastructure investments that we need and the kinds of trillions of dollars of energy upgrade and housing upgrades and so forth that we need with the creation of new green jobs, the guarantee of jobs, the guarantee of healthcare, the guarantee of retirement security, all of which will convince hopefully coal miners and loggers and all the people invested in the old ways of doing things, that this new society will be a good one for them and their children. Now, parallel to the eco-socialist movement developing over the last 35 years, there has also been a movement of explicit folks arguing from a green perspective for high technologies and various kinds of technologies, some of which veer over into techno fixes and some of which are not techno fixes, but I'll get to that in a second. I think one of the most important contributions was Stuart Brand's book, Whole Earth Discipline. He argues explicitly, as it says on the cover, cities are better than sprawl. People in cities use fewer resources and destroy less of the environment than sprawling populations. Nuclear power and GMOs will be necessary for a sustainable transition, both in terms of ensuring food security in the case of GMOs, but also ensuring energy sufficiency in terms of nuclear power. And that geoengineering should at least be explored and perhaps implemented, maybe inescapable. These are all, of course, incredibly controversial positions, and there were many environmentalists who either ignored or immediately disabused Stuart Brand of his notions. But eventually, a group around the Breakthrough Institute formed Brand and others into a grouping, and they signed the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. And eco-modernism endorsed many of these core ideas that the goal is to decouple the growth of human prosperity and the growth of economies from economic impacts, to intensify human technological activity in a way that would eventually allow us to have a high-tech, prosperous, high-growing economy, and not despoil or start reversing the despoilation of nature. And that includes urban density and nuclear power, GMOs, and geoengineering. Of course, these folks also got a lot of pushback, and they've had very little impact, I would argue, on environmental thinking because of their controversiality. However, there are people arguing at the intersection of these ideas. There are people like Peter Fraze, which I'll talk about in a second, Matt Huber, Lee Phillips, and organizations around the world who are open to and who are, in the first place, they're critical of the Luddism of much of the environmental movement, open to the possibility that emerging technologies are part of the solution for sustainability, but who also have a systemic critique, a systemic political understanding of why we got where we got and what it would take to move to where we need to be. And that's missing in a lot of these eco-modernist presentations. They say, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had this new technology? Well, yes, except that corporations don't see it as profitable. People don't want to adopt it. How do we get there if we don't massively change the political economy? That's the question that we face. So my proposal is that the Technoprogressive project is to identify what we see as a 250-year-old tradition from the liberal and egalitarian parts of the Enlightenment thought that we can find in many different movements that are open to science, technology, and reason as being part of the solution, an inescapable complement of the solution to the problems that we face, but also recognizes that we need a more just and a more liberal future in order to achieve those solutions. The people at the intersection of this are these socialist eco-modernists, socialists, eco-socialists who have adopted or who argue for various kinds of technologies that are considered verboten in the rest of the ecological movement. So those include people like Lee Phillips, whose book, Austerity Ecology, Collapse Porn Addicts, put the finger solely on, if you keep arguing that a green future is going to be one where you don't have social media, you don't have the internet, you don't have more electricity, you don't have space travel, you don't have flying rocket backpacks, then we're never going to get there because no one wants to live in that future. The people who want to live in a future that's high tech and a growing economy. We have to figure out how to make that compatible with the ecological vision. Parallel to that, there are the folks arguing that capitalism itself, the kind of accelerationist argument, capitalism itself is giving birth to post-capitalism. It's going to eliminate jobs. It's going to transition us from whatever kind of capitalism we're in now to something new. These folks also have ecological visions, and there's an overlap between these two groups, which I can't go into now. But basically, the idea that high technology could be part of the solution, which is also problematic in certain forms of left-wing thought, is here applied to an accelerationist vision. Now, I want to point especially to Peter Frase's book, For Futures, because I think the methodology, it's both very accommodating for technoprogressives who tend to like science fiction and futurist scenario building, but his methodology is a very useful one for us to think about. What if we decouple the arguments of historical inevitability here, what if we achieved some combination of scarcity or abundance and equality or hierarchy in our future? What kinds of societies would that generate? His argument is that a society that pursues current trends and has abundance but maintains existing social hierarchies and inequalities would end up exploiting people through rent on intellectual property. I won't go into the argument here, but if you're familiar with the post-capitalist arguments, just because everybody has a magic nano printer that can make all their stuff doesn't mean they own the intellectual property rights to the patents on the magic nano things that they're producing. Exterminism is inequality plus scarcity. That means we lock down the borders, we start shooting people on sight. If you lose your job in this future economy or you're not in a gated community, tough luck for you, et cetera, et cetera. Equality under scarcity conditions means making sure that everyone has an equal amount of limited stuff. And equality under abundance conditions means we have all kinds of possibilities for organizing ourselves politically and economically. He calls it communism. So in review of the Viridian Manifesto, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with this afternoon, I think—
So one more minute, James.
One more minute. Okay, good. I'm right at the end. In review, I think the Viridian Manifesto represents a number of political compromises. It could definitely use more eco-modernism. It takes a pass on GMOs. It endorses carbon capture, but it's pretty cautious about nuclear power. It's cautious about geoengineering. I think it could also use a substantial dose of eco-socialism, an understanding of how we got here, what the constraints are moving forward in terms of social and economic policy. So again, just in conclusion, I see our role as promoting an attractive, plausible, equal, and sustainable future that takes account of emerging technologies and pursuing arguments against right-wing futurism that tends to promote techno fixes or libertarian free market solutions, and against the kinds of Luddism in the left and environmental movements, to coalesce these kinds of thinkers across different movements into a coherent techno-progressive worldview. And I see the Viridian Manifesto as an important step in this direction, but one that could use some work. Thanks so much.
I'll just feed in one question very quickly from Dean Bubley, who suggests that the ideas of changing the system have been around for 100 years and haven't gone anywhere. And maybe it's better to figure out which techno fixes are working and get on with them. And the ideas of changing the system are just a pie in the sky. Do you have a quick response to that?
Well, I don't know why you would look at the last 100 years and say that changing the system is pie in the sky. I mean, Europeans enjoy universal healthcare. Americans do not. We pay 50 to 100% more for healthcare than you do. There are clear examples of public policy that are adopted under social democracy that are not adopted under free market regimes that make enormous consequences. I mean, and the environmental legislation that's been adopted since the 1960s in the United States has made a substantial impact on the cleanliness and the breathability of our air and the cleanliness of our water. Carbon capture schemes, they may not be go far enough, but they are a substantial improvement. The investment of the Chinese state, although it has a lot of problems and there's a lot of hype, the capacity of the Chinese state to set an ecological course and make the necessary public policy to get us there is an example that state policy can be incredibly effective in changing to an ecologically sustainable direction. I don't understand why anyone would look at the history of the last 100 years and say, social change is irrelevant. Let's just try to invent our way out of the problem.
So I've been a bit unfair to Dean's question, but let's continue that particular line of discussion in the chat. and maybe afterwards. It is time, thanks very much, James. It is time to move on to the next speaker, who is the Executive Director of Humanity Plus and recognized as the co-founder of modern transhumanism, Natasha Vita-More. Natasha, over to you.